Welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival. My name's Stuart Kelly. I'm a writer and critic, and it's a pleasure to be here today with Philip Hensher to discuss the anthology that he's compiled, The Golden Age of British Short Stories, 1890 to 1914. Oh, snap! Can I just thank at the outset the Quarterly's Book Group, which have sponsored this event. And can I thank all of you for the amount that you put into the festival over the 10 days. It means that we will be able to do more next year, more over the year. And just my heartfelt thanks and welcome. Please give a virtual welcome to Philip Hensher.
Thank you.
Philip, I want to begin with the introduction, rather than the stories you have selected. You write very persuasively and eloquently about why the short story had such a golden age during 1890 and 1914. And it seems almost a very Marxist interpretation that, there was the audience, there was the capital that was behind it, there was a sense that the three-decker novel was now on the way out. Just tell me a bit about why you think this period has such a sort of efflorescence of the short story.
Well, I think there are a number of factors that come together in a very happy way to create a big readership for the short story and the sort of audience that the sort of audience that will appreciate this and where it suits their lifestyle. Firstly, this is the first period when the not just the majority, but the whole of the British reading public, the British people were literate. In 1914, research has shown 99% of Britons could read and write, and this is unique in Europe. I think at the same time in Italy, about 60% of people could write. This was a product of the universal education laws that started a little earlier, and by 1890 there was a large audience that wanted things to read. There was more money about than ever before, and quite ordinary middle class or working class people had a little bit more money to spend. At the same time, printing technology was advancing and becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So at the beginning of the 19th century, a penny could buy you a page, a chapbook, a page of a chapbook, something really just a single sheet to give away. By the end of the century, there were publishers who were selling entire classic novels for a penny. This sort of created this, and in retrospect, this period is a sort of vacuum. Much later, after the First World War, really, other forms of mass entertainment would arise, like the cinema and radio, that would start to compete for readers' attention. But at this point, between 1890 and 1914, if you wanted an enormous public with some spare money to throw at you, then one of the best ways to do it was to write a short story and sell it to a magazine that published fiction. There's a huge number of magazines that are arising in this period of very different sorts. I think that scholars have determined that between 1890 and 1910, there was something like, 23 magazines in London alone that were exclusively publishing fiction. This started really with the foundation of the Strand magazine in 1891, and the Strand magazine is really the thing that changes everything. They decided to publish it once a month. They charged sixpence for it. It's beautiful quality. The quality of the paper, the printing, the illustrations. Even now, if you pick up a copy of the Strand magazine in a bound library, it's an absolute pleasure to read it. You know, it hasn't faded. The pages are still strong. The print is beautiful. The illustrations are absolutely gripping. Before long, they had found too their big selling point, which was a gentleman called Sherlock Holmes. And soon they were selling 500,000 copies of the Strand magazine every month at sixpence a copy. This had all sorts of effects for the people who wrote for the Strand. It meant that you could make a lot of money writing a short story for them. They were very soon paying Conan Doyle £100 per 1,000 words for a short story, and £100 for 1,000 words for a short story. I think there are quite a lot of authors even now who would be pretty happy to get that in cash terms. In 1890s terms, you know, if you're paying somebody £5,000, if you're paying somebody £500 for a 5,000 word short story, £600 for 6,000 word short story, which was their standard length, that's getting on for twice the annual salary of a family doctor. So, you know, not all the contributors to the Strand got that, but quite a lot of people were getting somewhere between £300 and £500 for a short story. That is really going to encourage people to invest a lot of their literary energy in writing short stories. When people wrote a short story for the Strand, they weren't kind of tossing it off in the interstices between writing novels. Sorry, am I talking to you?
No.
Okay. There is a very important reaction to this as well. I mean, the Strand is wonderful, but it's only one way of thinking about what literature could be, and in some ways, it is quite a rigid approach. The short stories had to be 6,000 words. They occasionally said to beginning writers, we want you to put in a paragraph praising another author. So you'll find these strange kind of detective stories by now unheard of writers saying how important it was that the detective had learnt from Sherlock Holmes and had read his, you know, and it's quite ridiculous. So it's, you know, there are wonderful things in the Strand, but it's not the only way of thinking of it. And quite soon after the foundation of the Strand, magazines started arising, which would as magazines, things, the Yellow Book, exquisite production, very expensively produced, tissue paper in front of every engraving, beautiful, heavy, handmade paper, 5 shillings an issue. The sense really is of, let's do something so exquisite, the sort of awful, vulgar people who read the Strand will never, ever be able to afford it. They won't see the point of it. And the editor of the Yellow Book, Henry Harland, after it had all come to an end, and of course, you know, it didn't last for very long, he wrote an essay, which is really the founding principle of one approach to the short story, saying that the short story is and only can be an exquisite, withdrawn impression of the world. In other words, it's not a Strand short story with a mystery and somebody getting shot in the dark and you know, a twist in the tale. Even it's it's something more like Chekhov, something that would lead to Katherine Mansfield. So really, there's this very kind of exciting debate going on between people who just want to appeal to as wide an audience as possible, and people who really want to withdraw into a kind of ivory tower of exquisiteness. And out of that, there's a very good book about this by John Carey called The Intellectuals and the Masses. That was really the founding principles of modernism. And you can see the whole thing playing out in the kind of market of the short story in the magazines in these years. It's a very productive moment.
Before we get to the substance of your selection, you mentioned there that radio and cinema kind of took the heels out from the short story. And yet, when I think nowadays, I mean, if I had a penny for every publisher who said to me, oh, well, we just don't do short stories, they don't sell, I'd have maybe 25 pence. But the radio does seem to be where the short story has migrated to. You know, Radio 3 and Radio 4 both still commission original work.
Mm.
Has it become a more oral form than a textual form?
Well, without sounding quite, without sounding mean, I would say that the limits of BBC's interest in short stories is the bottom line. And a BBC commissioner will say, "We'd like you to write a short story, and we can pay." And the sum of money that is offered, it's not very much. It's the sort of sum that might make you write something out of the goodness of your heart. Really, the only way that you can really kind of create a lively body of work is really appealing to people's self-interest. I know that sounds kind of harsh, but otherwise we're leaving it in the hands of hobbyists or or people who can only do it now and again, really. So it might be. I think that the radio is not necessarily the answer. The answer to your question might be yes, if the short story was somehow persuaded into a sort of live performance aspect. I don't know why nobody's tried this as far as I know, but I don't see why on an open mic night someone can't come along and ask the audience to pay £5 each for an hour and just listen to somebody reading or telling them a story. That might be absolutely great. But the BBC, it supports it as far as anybody supports short stories these days. But on the whole, no, I don't think it's really as energetic as the literary life here.
Well, certainly it seems that poetry seems to have managed to make some kind of transition into the spoken world. But I want to get into the meat of the book.
Okay.
Now, there are authors here that everyone will know about. People like Kipling, Hardy, Wyndham Lewis, Forster, Chesterton. How did you go about selecting from their oeuvre which story you wanted in that particular book?
Yeah, it was some of them. It was so hard. I think that I wanted sometimes to move away a little bit from the most anthologized piece.
The real faces, as we say up here. The real Kent faces, as we say up here.
Yeah, exactly. So I made the perverse decision to put a Conan Doyle story in, which wasn't a Sherlock Holmes story, because I thought everyone knows the Sherlock Holmes stories, and actually there's a lot in Conan Doyle that's terribly interesting. And this is about a Brazilian wild beast that's kept. It's a glorious story. I think that sometimes I wanted to put a short story in that was very influential on other people, to show a kind of tendency. So the one that the Forster story that I put in has been anthologized a fair bit. The Celestial Omnibus.
The Celestial Omnibus, yes.
There was a choice between that one and a truly prophetic one called The Machine Stops, which basically tells.
That's just what I was going to ask. Why you chose that one, The Machine Stops.
Well, Machine Stops is an astonishing story. It really foretells the internet. It really foretells what we're doing now, actually, talking to each other remote distances, giving lectures to unseen audiences. The reason I put the Celestial Omnibus in is that so many people imitated it afterwards. It's about the marriage of high culture made flesh, of gods, of a sort of magical fantasy, and you can find so many short stories in the 20 years after it was published about kind of everyday life, kind of going into the magical. That I thought that was probably a more important story for Forster's contemporaries than the Machines. I think they really would have got the Machine Stops in as strongly as we do. So there's a sort of skewed aspect to it. Yeah.
Certainly something like Wells. Again, you have so much to choose from there.
Yeah.
The Argonauts of the Air is a strange choice. I mean, I always get torn with Wells between whether you're going for the technological romance or whether you're going for that really beautiful sort of slightly quaint pastoral side of Wells. Yeah. So why did you come down on that story?
I think the thing that appealed to me very much about the Argonauts of the Air was the absolute specificity, down to a point of, explaining engineering to readers about a technology that just doesn't exist. How are we going to manage the heavier than air flight? 10 or 15 years before the Wright brothers, and of course it's exactly wrong. But reading the short story, you could almost build these machines. I don't know. I'll take advice on that one. So I think that one of the things that I did like very much about the short story in this period was that it did see part of its job as informing readers, and that sort of thing seemed to me to survive much better than some of the social attitudes, So I know Wells is actually terribly difficult to choose from. In the previous anthology that I put him into, the 2-volume Penguin, well, I put in an even stranger one about a magic shop that seems to be run by the devil. I think that in that case, I wanted something that was going to chime with other demonic stories in the anthology. With this one, I wanted it to chime with a sense of technology and improvement. But I mean, these are this is my choice. I really hope that there are going to be many other anthologies of the period in which people make completely different choices.
Well, one would hope so, but I think this one is such a kind of warm bath of a book that one can actually just, sit back and relax and know that every single thing there is of a particular quality. I've seen it reviewed and people saying it's the perfect book for Christmas, and I would wholeheartedly agree. But it's also a very intelligent and very subtle book, much like your own novels. And I want to turn to Henry James, who we don't think of as being a short story writer. And I think I've only just got to the age where I actually appreciate James the way I never could when I was 20. The Figure in the Carpet is an astonishing work. A lot of the work that we tend to go to first in James tends to be the shorter work. I mean, nobody's going to the Princess Casamasiwa in a hurry, or the Golden Bowl.
I don't agree with that. I love the Princess Casamasiwa. It's absolutely glorious. It's his attempt at being Dickens, I think. I think it's fascinating. And
what does James do in the short form? Because, we are quite used to the sort of orotund sentences of James. What can he do in the short form?
Okay. Well, I mean, you've come to me at quite a good moment, because I've just reread The Awkward Age for the first time since I was 17, and I thought I understood it when I was 17. And I've just reread it, and I realised that not only did I not understand it when I was 17, I have no idea what it's about now. I got about halfway through it. I thought, James doesn't want you to know what these characters are doing. I got to the end of it and I had no idea what the motivation of the heroine, Nanda Brookenham, really was, or what we were supposed to think of her. And it just seemed like life. Now, I think the short stories, and I quite agree with you, it's been quite difficult to read James's short stories until quite recently, because there hasn't really been a very easily accessible edition of the whole lot. Now, the Library of America did in five volumes, every short story of James, and it's an extraordinary sequence to read through. I think that James had this tendency that increased as he went on, to make sure that he wasn't going to come to definite conclusions. And there are certainly novels at the end of which the Sacred Fount is an outstanding example.
Yes, an astonishing.
It took me 9 attempts to get to the end of the Sacred Fount, and it's only 150 pages long. 8 times I got a certain distance into it, and I thought, I'm understanding, I'm not understanding. Go back to the beginning. And I had to do that 9 times. And finally, I got to the end of it. I understood it for about half an hour, and then it had gone again. And in these short stories, I mean, it's a very alluring experience when you get into it, the experience of being baffled. The short stories, they are increasingly a question of, where are you, the reader, standing, and where is the point of view of this fiction? Where is that going to be standing? The stories towards the end, like The Jolly Corner, which I think is one of the greatest short stories ever written, but you just couldn't push it in an anthology because people would just stare. It's so strange, and you just do not know what is happening. And similarly, The Figure in the Carpet, I think, is absolutely wonderful, but you just don't know really whether you're holding the hand of the narrator, or whether the narrator is somebody who you don't want to be left alone with at all. That's it's a much more ambiguous experience, even than The Turn of the Screw. I think my reading of The Turn of the Screw is a perhaps unpopular one, which is that once somebody has told you the interpretation that says there are no ghosts, the governess is actually just forcing her psychotic view of the world on these children. Once that possibility emerges for the reader, the innocent reading is gone. You can't recover it. You cannot get back to the point where the ghosts are real. As he goes on, it becomes much, much more successfully ambiguous what he wants to do, which is that we really do not know what the answer is in The Figure of the Carpet. It's really kind of enacting that kind of act of interpretation that says there is something simple there, or there isn't something simple there. It's just all in the act of interpretation. James is certainly somebody that's it's controversial to put him into this, because he was only a British citizen for 8 months at the end of his life. But
I think he's deservedly there, and I'm so glad you mentioned Sacred Fount, which for me was the book that unlocked James to me. Right, this is what you're playing at.
Oh my goodness.
Certainly with something like The Turn of the Screw, I keep on going back to that whole thing that the governess is nameless, whereas all the other people have names with significance. I want to talk a little bit about the female authors you put in here. And rather than looking at Katherine Mansfield, who obviously is somebody that anyone of taste thinks is wonderful. But it was Ella Darcy, the first book, which I read, and I thought, I have never read something like this. Every single sentence seems to twist its own syntax and trip the reader up in some way. So tell me a bit about Ella Darcy. I mean, who even was she? I'd never read it. And one of the joys of this book is to have things which I had never seen and which I will now cleave to.
Yes, she was a very prominent literary figure in the circle round the Yellow Book. I would say that she probably has quite an important editorial input into the work. It's sort of not really acknowledged in the accounts of themselves that the Yellow Book gave, because she was a woman, really. I think that there isn't a lot of writing by her, but it's all very interesting. She made a big impact on her contemporaries. She surfaces in memoirs all the time, sometimes rather insultingly described. And then after the First World War, I think she settled in Paris, and she's last glimpsed as the translator of one of the very first Penguins, the Andre Maurois Ariel, the life of Shelley, and then she disappears. I think the place in literary history of a lot of women in particular, it sort of disappears when short story stops being such a kind of fluid, magazine-based contemporary style of thing. She was there. She was making her mark. And then the means by which a writer like that could make their mark slightly disappears after the First World War.
It's an astonishing story that you've chosen for it. And when I was looking at it again and looking at the way in which the structure of the very sentences seems to work, I mean, I just opened it at random. Why indeed, thought Willoughby, marvelling at his own idiocy. And yet, such is the inconsistency of man, not wholly without the desire to kiss her again. That not wholly without, there's a kind of grain of ambiguity put into almost every sentence. And the fact that it does deal with ideas of masculinity, ideas of class, the fact that Esther, the woman in the story, is transliterated into a kind of demotic form, struck me as just something that I'd never seen.
Yeah, and it really doesn't go in the direction that you think it's going to. I think that your sympathies are constantly shifting, and sometimes your sympathies are quite abruptly withdrawn from the teller of the tale, if you like. I do think that there's a lot in the book about what women's voices are to do. Really, how can we detach ourselves from what we're supposed to be doing? And a lot of this is to do really with the sense that the story that they're working, the form that they're working in, is a very specifically modern form. Nobody had really thought about the short story called the short story until 20 years before that. In the 1870s, you still find magazines explaining to their readers what a short story is. I think that if they're doing something in a new form, taking new attitudes, writing consciously new sentences, then you are going to create an Ella Darcy. You're ultimately going to create a Katherine Mansfield. It's a very important moment.
Mary Mann was the other one whom I had never heard of, to my sorrow and shame. Okay. But again, there's a certain degree of regionalism which is something that you've worked with in your own fiction, talking about places outside of the Great Wen. So just talk me through what attracted you to that particular story by her.
Well, Mary Mann's been on my reading horizons for a while now, and A.S. Byatt, in her wonderful Oxford Book of the English short story, put an absolutely astonishing short story by Mary Mann in about a dead child in a very poor family. Really one of the most shocking stories. DJ Taylor's a great fan, and is doing a lot for her. She's sort of surfaced in recent years. It is true in this period that because of the economic power of London, probably more writers than ever before or since were based in London and were writing about things outside London from a sort of news from elsewhere sort of way. The real regional writer in this period is much rarer than it would be in the 1920s and the 1930s. Mary Mann is a very kind of solid presence who really investigated her surroundings of Norfolk from an ideal, from a socially idealizing sort of way. She had a very, very good ear for dialogue, and not in a picturesque way, not in a kind of comic yokel way, but just really listening to how people talk. There were quite a few short stories by her that I could have put in.
Indeed, and I'm interested in regionalism particularly. You include Arnold Bennett, which I think one would be obliged to do.
Yeah.
Bennett's reputation has not particularly stood up in the recent decades. The Virginia Woolf essay in which he gets pilloried. The older I get, the more I find novels like Bennett's very subtle, very distinct. It isn't just a kind of sausage machine of, look at this rural, rustic, industrial piece of exotica for London. So tell me a bit about Bennett and actually, how does he play into your writing?
Well, Bennett is certainly somebody who anybody, any writer could learn an enormous amount from. That essay by Virginia Woolf, it's polemic. It's putting a counterintuitive case. It's kind of mocking a kind of monument of writing. But in the years since it was written, a lot of attitudes have shifted, and it's supposed to be. I mean, I've talked to people about Arnold Bennett who've known that they're not supposed to like Arnold Bennett, but have never read any of his novels. Now, some of there's a lot of Bennett's novels that are astonishingly skillful pieces of work, and the general principle. I mean, I think actually in some ways, Virginia Woolf's principles of novel writing are pretty strange. There's an essay. There's somewhere or other she says about Dickens that his idea of how to keep a novel going is to throw another handful of characters onto the fire. Well, I think that any novelist would understand after a while that you can create more energy in a novel as it goes on by giving a new couple of characters a chance. So I don't understand that. The point about that she makes about Bennett is that he's too invested in the inarticulate things of the world. It's true that, like many realist novelists, many European realist novelists, he is very interested in telling us what somebody has in front of them in their house. I think that, for novelists like Flaubert and Balzac and Zola, who meant a lot to Bennett, but didn't really mean anything much to Virginia Woolf, I think that sorry, I just had a strange message on the screen. I think that it is a means of telling us not only how people think of themselves, their psychological reality in external ways, but shows how they relate to the society that they find themselves in, how things change for larger kind of communities. And really about a sort of external reality that's easier to talk about for those characters in a truthful way than about the psychology. If you want to find out about somebody, really find out about another human being, you don't say to them, what sort of person are you, and allow them to indulge in a monologue. You break into their house when they're not there, and you have a good poke round at what they've got at home. So Bennett got it exactly right. He's also, very acutely aware of some quite kind of overlooked social settings. And the story that I put in the book, The Death of Simon Fugue, which I think is one of the greatest short stories in the world, is astonishing, is about a long night in a provincial northern town among aesthetes and intellectuals, and just the way in which people love art. They love avant-garde European music. There's a moment when they're all quite drunk on champagne, and two of them sit down and play the Richard Strauss Sinfonia Domestica in a two four-hand version. It's only just been, and it's just wonderfully convincing, because Bennett can tell you exactly who they are, where they come from, what they've got in their houses. Bennett had an enormous social range, and it was completely secure in every detail. I think he's well overdue a serious revival, actually.
I think too. In fact, the story reminded me of that wonderful line of William Gaddis, the underrated American novelist, when the person says, "Oh, I do love modern music, just not to listen to," which I've been to many a party like that.
Yes, I know, yes. Yeah.
One of the other people whom I didn't know at all is Israel Zangwill.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about why it was important to have him as part of this eclectic mixture.
One of the wonderful things that a magazine a literary magazine this period could do, that becomes a lot harder if you don't have a regular outlet for short fiction, is to give a few pages to somebody who's not from the central methods of cultural production. They didn't go to they didn't go to private school or to Oxford or Cambridge. They might have come from a very deprived background, like another writer here, Arthur Morrison. They might not be interested in writing in conventional ways, or they might come from a society completely outside of centralized white European culture. Israel Zangwill is a fantastic example of a writer who one editor at some point said, "Well, we could find 3 pages for him in this month's issue." He was a first generation Jewish immigrant from Russia, and he wrote some quite kind of light-hearted but very authentic stories about what it was like to live in an exclusively Jewish society in Whitechapel. He really knew that area. And they caught on. People liked that first short story. They commissioned him to write some more. Before long, he's producing volumes of short fiction. He wrote some novels with the same setting. He starts to become a public figure. is a very important figure in the history of Zionism before the First World War, and actually the magazines did this repeatedly with some very kind of surprising people, and they went on doing it for decades. I mean, the Windrush generation, we have writers like Sam Selvin. It was the first opportunity that V.S. Naipaul had in the 1950s. An editor simply saying, "Well, we've got a few pages spare. Let's ask this person to write a story about what it's like to come from somebody somewhere else." And Israel Zangwill was one of the first of it. If they'd been a little bit more imaginative, we would have had even more of it, because going through the magazines, it is possible you find quite regularly non-fiction pieces. It was more natural to an editor to say to an educated Black African, what is it like to do this? Not in fictional form. I was much hoping to find a Black writer of fiction from this period. I think that would have been truly startling to readers. But unfortunately, the only writing that I could find was in non-fictional memoir form. But who knows? Something might surface. Israel Zangwill is such a lovable writer as well. He's just very kind of sunny and charming, and he's got a real way of telling this story. It's wonderful.
And it's a story which you've included, which is, I suppose one form of the short story is the joke.
Yeah.
So that there's going to be a trip up towards the end. The other major form, and you include, of course, it would be impossible not to, M.R. James. And one thing we've been discussing over the course of the past 10 days at Wigtown has been the ghost story. It must be very difficult to select just one of James, and not just to choose the obvious one like "Oh Whistle" and "I'll Come to You, My Lad," or "Canon Alberich." How did you go? Well, no, tell me more about why the ghost story works as a short story.
Well, I think it is supremely a short story form, because it depends not on the exact recreation of a whole world, but on suggestion, implication. The moment at the end of many M.R. James stories, when he said something like, "I started to read the explanation, but after a while I shut the book and looked out of the window for a long time," or something. The idea that you have to imagine for yourself the sheer horror of what they're coming across. The Abbott Thomas treasure, which I put in the book, is quite an obvious choice. People do know it. I put it in because the climax of the short story is the most horrifying sentence in the English language, apart from one, and the other one is also in M.R. James. The most horrifying sentence in the English language is this: "There is no kitchen cat." And when you come across that, it's in the stalls of Barchester Cathedral. When you come to that sentence, your hair stands on end. You just can't believe the horror, and it's that really the sense of where M.R. James is coming from. This very kind of respectable, demure, learned person, and these horrible things that he's imagining, and also the peculiarity, I think, of James's own psychology comes in a very interesting way. I've often thought that the stories reveal the psychology of somebody who could imagine nothing worse than being touched by another human being. And
that is correct.
The horrifying climax of Abbott Thomas's treasure comes when he's aware of a sort of face moving very slowly forwards and backwards across his own. And that kind of intimacy, you know, M.R. James, Cambridge Dawn, I think was just a horrifying one for him. But they're wonderful James stories. I wish there were twice as many of them.
Indeed, and you know, something like An Uncommon Prayer Book, I could read again and again and again, and I still can't figure out quite how he put it all together, how the clockwork works.
Yeah.
Now, we have a few questions coming in from the audience. You'll forgive my skeletal hand that may be going up to the part there. So the first question is, which contemporary writers would you most recommend for someone just starting to explore short fiction?
Well, I did put together an anthology of the contemporary British short story for Penguin, but the short story writer I'm going to recommend is a writer who really I only came across this year with the production of a colossal 3-volume collection of 101 short stories, what would be called weird short stories, called Robert Sheerman. I can't recommend this enough. He's put together a collection of short stories that follows the sort of structure of a form that only really existed in the late 1970s and 1980s, a sort of make your own adventure book. I never really kind of got into those, but I recognized them as soon as I saw it. You get to the end of one short story and he says, if you liked this about this short story, you may like to go to this short story. And there's a path that you have to follow through this vast anthology. They're superb short stories. They just create a new world with every beginning. They have a definite spirit of gusto and horror, but there's a sort of it's not. You feel as exactly with M.R. James that there's a real kind of psychological basis for it. They feel very kind of truthful stories, even if he's writing about something that could never and will never happen. So I utterly recommend that. Robert Sheerman. It's what's it called? We all
hear stories in the dark.
We all hear stories in the dark. Yeah, it's a nightmare to get hold of. I warn you, you have to write to the publisher, but I could not recommend it more.
I suppose the one that always chimes with Robert Sheerman's work in my head is M. John Harrison's recent selected stories, which, you know, one thinks of him as being a science fiction writer, and when you read them, you think, actually, this is science past. This is, you know, yes. There are so many writers. I suppose, I mean, I wonder if you could just ruminate slightly on the fact that a lot of the short story writers who have had a career in short story writing tend to be women, whether it's Alice Munro or A.L. Kennedy or Ali Smith. I mean, you don't see Martin Amis doing a book of short stories.
Oh, no, he has. He has. I think
he has, but they're not very good.
Harsh. No, I think some of them. Anyway. Well, I think the brutal explanation is that women are allowed to take over a literary genre when nobody really thinks it's important anymore. Those writers, they've had a long journey to create a real sense of authority. I think that when people, I'm not really talking so much about Ali and Alison and Alice. Gosh, what a coincidence! Is that odd? Ali and Alison and Alice, yeah. I'm not really talking about them because they really are authors of great authority, but there is certainly a way in which the short story competition culture is kind of generously handed over to women writers, because it's not something that that people think is all that important, really. If you only have to think of the difference between the ease with which women are shortlisted for a short story prize and the utter difficulty that women film directors have in Hollywood of getting permission to work, really, to see that it's a matter of what the culture really thinks is important or not. We're lucky in this period that that there were women who did find a way into this culture, but clearly, I would say it was still pretty difficult for them.
There's one point here which is a comment rather than a question. Just saying that they are so glad that you have given Arnold Bennett a boost.
Yeah.
Clear is terrific, and I'd agree. Certain languages this is a secondary question, do seem to lend themselves particularly well to short fiction. Is English one of them? That's a very interesting.
Well, I don't know really. I have to say that I did an anthology last year for Everyman about Berlin stories, and it was true that there wasn't quite the richness of short fiction in German that I was expecting, and actually a lot of the great German short story writers like Adalbert Stifter were working away from the metropolis in a way that seemed kind of strange to an English writer. So in the end, the book of Berlin stories is actually a selection of extracts from novels. I don't know whether there's anything intrinsic in languages to say that. There certainly are. I think there are kind of factors that create propitious circumstances for short stories. Clearly, clearly kind of Russian culture in the second half of the 19th century was just somewhere that was very open. There was a very lively periodical culture that was very open to innovation, and they had a kind of strong sense of the form from much earlier than before. These things are often much more to do with publishing culture than with languages. One of the reasons, for instance, that the short story started up much earlier in America than in the UK was that it was much harder for American writers to get novels published because the American reading public had a lot of pirated editions of British novels to read. So someone like Poe found it very difficult to get a novel published against this kind of background of cheap rip-offs, and was kind of was pushed rather into writing short stories. It would be a very interesting question to ask about what effect a language might have. I don't really know, because I speak a couple of foreign languages, but I have a sense that there are cultures like Japanese literature is absolutely full of fascinating short stories. The French have always gone on publishing great short stories. I don't know. It's not only something that I don't think I can answer, but I'm not sure that anybody can.
Very, very interesting question to ponder, given that if one is thinking about the absolute titans of the short story, you would have something like Kafka there.
Yeah.
Or Borges. So, there are people from very many different languages who have excelled in this. One thing that I would observe is that Spanish or Spanish languages tend to have a lot of interconnected collections of short stories, which is a form which we don't really do in English.
No, I don't know. I don't agree with that. I think it's. I think that it's actually a form that is on the increase and has.
I think it's on the rise. Yes.
Yeah. it's actually quite easy to get away with publishing a collection of short stories if you can persuade your publisher that they are connected in
actually a novel.
Yeah, but there are works going back really to Cranford that are basically kind of collections of short stories set in the same place or connected in some way. I'd be very interested to hear about the Spanish collections of short stories. It's not really something I've gone into.
Alfau's Locos, the comedy of gestures. Absolutely brilliant.
Brilliant.
One question before we have to tie things up. Would you consider doing an anthology of the American short story?
I've sometimes thought of it in a kind of imperialist sort of depending on America and explaining what's good about writing. I think I'd last about 5 minutes before the national outrage drove me out of town with pitchforks. I do think that there is certainly there would be quite an interesting anthology to put together about the sort of American writers that British readers like. And I think it's not necessarily the same as the ones that American readers like. I think one of the titans of the American story is James Thurber. And I've never heard an American writer these days talk about him. I think he's absolutely wonderful. I think his non-fiction memoir, My Years with Ross, that's one of the greatest books ever written about publishing. It's just astonishing. And I don't know. I do like the American short story. I do think it's fine. There's some things that American readers really go for now, like Raymond Carver, that I just cannot abide. And I think they sort of neglect the sort of, I think from our point of view, they do have a bit of a tendency to neglect writers who are the sort of John Cheever, Three Martini. Was that really a joke, or was it just an outrageous comment? I love Cheever. I absolutely adore him. And a recent writer, I think, is in the same kind of category. There's a very, very good writer called Joy Williams. And you do sometimes read one of her short stories and you think, was that funny? And it's just so bleak. There's a short story that I'm constantly giving to my students who sometimes love it and sometimes outraged by it, about a mother whose son dies of a heroin overdose, and she finds herself at the funeral having to entertain all his friends, who, of course, are not only still drug addicts, but spend the course of the funeral getting absolutely off their faces and making less and less sense. And it's kind of bleak, but hilarious. And Joy Williams has never, I mean, people like her in America, but I don't really get her in the way that bad taste English readers do. So the answer is really no one is going to ask me to do that. And I think I wouldn't dare.
I rather think you should, because personally, any anthology which prioritizes Cheever over Carver will certainly get a good review from me.
Thank you.
So it's been an absolute joy to speak to you. It's a wonderful, wonderful anthology, and
thank you.
I will be buying many copies of it. I think it's the top of my Christmas list as a gift to give to people. This is the last time I'll be with you in Wigtown, even though I'm not with you in Wigtown. Thank you all for your company. Thank you all for your donations. And please give a large virtual clap to Philip Hensher.